I wasn't researching genetic anomalies when I started this investigation. I was helping my neighbor set up her DNA test results, a birthday gift from her kids, something fun, Ancestry.com, or 23andMe, or one of those companies that promise to connect you to your past. The results came back in 2 weeks. Ancestry data unavailable, not unclear, not inclusive, not we need more information. Unavailable. Like the data itself couldn't exist. She thought it was a glitch, called customer service. They apologized, sent a replacement kit. Same result. She tried a different company, same message, processing error, ancestry data unavailable. I thought it was strange, but I moved on, forgot about it, until 3 months later, when I saw a Reddit thread with 4,000 comments, all of them describing the same thing, the same error, different companies, different countries, the same impossible result. I started mapping them. Every person who posted, every error message, every frustrated call to customer service that went nowhere. 2 million people, 2 million DNA tests that came back with the same message. 2 million descendants of something the algorithms couldn't identify. 2 million threads leading back to grandparents who came from villages that don't exist on any map. That's when I realized this wasn't a technical problem. Someone had built the error on purpose. Someone had programmed every major DNA testing company in the world to reject these samples, to quarantine them, to make sure no one would ever trace them back to where they came from. And when I found out why, everything I thought I knew about history collapsed. Ancestry data unavailable. I've spent 2 years trying to understand why. What I found terrified me, not because of what it revealed, but because of what someone has worked very hard to hide. Her name is Maria. She lives in a town in upstate New York that exists in the space between farms and forgetting. The kind of place where people moved to disappear, where families arrived in the 1920s with strange accents and no photographs. Maria's family was one of them. My grandfather never talked about the old country, she told me the first time we spoke. Not where it was, not what language they spoke, not even its name. When I asked, he'd just say that place is gone, like it had been erased. Not destroyed, erased. She took the DNA test in 2019, a birthday gift from her son. Millions of people were doing it, finding lost relatives, mapping their heritage, connecting threads across oceans and centuries. Maria expected to find Polish ancestry, or Russian, maybe Ukrainian. Her grandfather's accent wandered between those borders, never settling. Instead, she found nothing. The test processed everything else. My mother's side came back clean, Irish, German, some Scandinavian, normal, detailed. But my father's side, my grandfather's side, just said, unable to determine ancestry, data inconsistent with reference populations. She thought it was a glitch. She called the company. They apologized, offered a free retest. Same result. The third representative I spoke to went quiet for a long time, Maria said. Then she said something strange. She said, "We've been seeing this pattern. We don't know what it means yet." Then she transferred me. The next person acted like that conversation never happened. Maria started searching online, forums, Reddit threads, Facebook groups. She found dozens of people with the same error, then hundreds, then thousands. They all had the same story. Grandparents from the old country. No photographs, no documents, villages that couldn't be found, languages that sounded familiar but matched nothing exactly, and DNA that the algorithms couldn't place. It was like we'd all descended from the same ghost, Maria said. A ghost that left no records. A people that history forgot, or was made to forget. I started mapping them. Every person who reached out, every error message, every family story. The patterns were impossible to ignore. The geographic origins clustered in a wide belt across Central Asia, the Urals, the Caucasus, Western Siberia. But these weren't random villages. When I plotted the family stories on a map, the places the grandparents mentioned, the routes they described, they formed a network. Ancient trade routes, caravan paths, cities that had been erased from modern maps but appeared in atlases from the 1700s. Names kept repeating. Tartary, the Great Tartary. The Kingdom of Sibir, places the textbooks called mythical, or exaggerated, or misunderstood by European cartographers. But 2 million people don't share the same DNA error because of a mapmaker's imagination. I found Dr. Elena Voskresenskaya in a cafe in Prague. She'd been a geneticist at one of the major testing companies. I won't say which one until 2021. She was fired, or restructured, as she put it with a bitter smile. I noticed the pattern in 2018, she said. We were getting thousands of samples that wouldn't process, not contaminated, not degraded. The DNA was clean, high quality, but our algorithms couldn't match it to any reference population. She stirred her coffee. Didn't drink it. That's not supposed to happen. Our databases have over 20 million reference samples. We have populations from every continent, every region, every ethnic group we've ever documented. If you have human DNA, we can tell you where your ancestors lived, but not these samples. These samples matched each other perfectly. Thousands of them, from people who'd never met, formed a distinct genetic cluster, a population, a real, definable, traceable population. She looked at me. One that doesn't exist in any of our databases. One that, according to our records, never existed at all. What did you do? I wrote a report, recommended we add them as a new reference population. Maybe some isolated group we'd missed, like the Kalash in Pakistan or the Basques. It happens. We discover new populations. And I was called into a meeting with people I'd never seen before, not from our company. They wore suits that cost more than my monthly salary. They asked me to delete the report, to reclassify the samples as processing errors, to never mention them again. Did they say why? Elena's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her cup, still didn't drink. One of them said something I'll never forget. He said, "That population is not supposed to exist, and it's our job to make sure it stays that way." I flew to Budapest in December, cold wind off the Danube, the kind of cold that settles in your bones and waits there. I was following a thread. A man named Tibor who'd posted on one of the forums. His family had kept something the others hadn't, a photograph. He met me in a cafe by the chain bridge. 60s, heavy coat, hands that had worked machines his whole life. He ordered palinka and didn't touch it. My grandmother came from a village called Kalimsk, he said. It was supposed to be in western Kazakhstan, near the Russian border, but there's no Kalimsk on any map. I've looked for 20 years. What did she tell you about it? She said it was beautiful. Stone buildings with windows made of crystal that sang when the wind blew. Streets paved with something she called black glass. Running water in every home, this in a village, in the 1800s. She said the stars look different there, closer. The photograph? He reached into his coat, hesitated, then slid it across the table. It was sepia-toned, faded, cracked at one corner. A group of people standing in front of a building. The architecture was unlike anything I'd seen. Curved walls, geometric patterns carved into stone, windows that seemed too tall, doorways that seemed too wide. The people wore clothing that looked vaguely Central Asian, vaguely Russian, vaguely something else entirely. But what caught my attention was the background. Rising behind the building, partially obscured by distance and photographic blur, was a structure. A tower. It spiraled upward in a way that hurt my eyes to follow. "That tower," I said. "Do you know what it is?" My grandmother called it the Meridian. She said everyone in the region knew it. It was the center of everything. When they left, when they had to leave, she said they looked back and watched it burning. She said the fire was blue. What happened to the village? Tibor was quiet for a long time. The palinka sat untouched. Outside, snow began to fall on the Danube. She said it was erased, not destroyed, erased. She said men came in uniforms she didn't recognize and told everyone to leave. They said the village had never existed. They said anyone who claimed otherwise would disappear too. He looked at me. She never told anyone but family, and she made us promise to never take DNA tests. "Did you?" "My daughter did, for fun," she said, 2 years ago. He picked up the palinka finally and drained it. The results came back. Ancestry data unavailable. She called me crying. She said, "Papa, it says I don't exist." I found a programmer in Tallinn. Estonia in winter is gray and white and endless, the kind of place where the sun barely rises and the nights go on forever. His name was Alexander. He'd worked for one of the smaller DNA testing companies, a European one, until 2020. He agreed to meet me at a bar in the old town. Stone walls, low ceilings, the smell of wood smoke, and old beer. "I built their matching algorithm," he said. "The system that compares your DNA to reference populations and tells you where your ancestors came from. I know how it works at the deepest level. So you understand the errors?" "I understand what the errors mean, yes." He was drinking something clear and strong. His hands were steady, but his eyes kept moving to the door. "The samples aren't unmatched. They're matched perfectly to each other, and to a database that isn't supposed to exist." "What do you mean?" "When a sample comes in that the algorithm can't process, it doesn't just fail. It sends a query to a secondary database. A hidden one. I found it by accident in 2019, buried in legacy code from before the company was acquired. Someone had built a separate matching system, a quarantine system. Quarantine for what? For them. For the samples that match the population that doesn't exist." He leaned closer. There are over 2 million samples in that quarantine database, 2 million people whose DNA matches a reference population that has been deliberately excluded from all public genetic databases worldwide. Who excluded them? I traced the code back. The original quarantine system was implemented in 2008, simultaneously by all major DNA testing companies. Not one, all of them. At the same time, using identical code, that would require coordination. It would require orders from someone with the authority to tell competitors to work together, someone with the power to threaten them into silence. Did you find out who? Alexander finished his drink, set the glass down with a click that sounded like a door closing. I found a folder, buried in the legacy system. It was called Meridian. Inside was a document from 1952, a set of instructions for how genetic research should be conducted going forward, how certain populations should be deprecated from all records, how certain genetic markers should be flagged and quarantined if they ever appeared. Who wrote it? The document was unsigned, but it was routed through something called the Bureau of Historical Continuity, an organization that, as far as any public record shows, never existed. I spent the next 6 months collecting stories, hundreds of them, then thousands, people from every continent, every background, every walk of life, all with the same impossible thing in common: DNA that the system couldn't place, and family stories that sounded like fever dreams. Elena, in Toronto. Her great-grandmother came from a city called Barnagrad, that she said was larger than Moscow. She described technology that didn't exist then, didn't exist until recently. Moving walkways, lights that needed no fire, windows that could show you places far away. Elena's DNA test came back, unable to determine ancestry. Marcus in Melbourne. His grandfather's family had been what he called glassworkers in a place called Tartarian. They said they worked with a material that was stronger than steel but clear as water. They built windows and domes and things I don't have words for. When my grandfather came to Australia in 1921, he brought a piece of it. Just a shard, small enough to hide. I still have it. Marcus showed me the shard via video call. It looked like glass but reflected light wrong. Colors that shouldn't have been there rippled across its surface. Every jeweler I've shown it to says the same thing. They don't know what it is. It doesn't match any known material. Ayumi in Osaka. Her family history was more fragmented, just a story passed down about ancestors who came from the west of the West, across deserts and mountains, carrying knowledge that couldn't be written down. My grandmother would make patterns in sand, Ayumi said. Geometric shapes. She said they were how her grandmother prayed. Not to gods, to the patterns themselves, to the mathematics that held the world together. Ayumi's DNA test showed complete Japanese ancestry on her mother's side, but her father's side returned the error. Pavel in Vladivostok. His family had been railway workers in the early Soviet period. My grandfather helped build the Trans-Siberian extension in the 1930s. He said they weren't building new lines, they were building over older ones. He said they found tunnels sometimes, and stations that had been built before the railway was even planned. Stations that had been deliberately buried. Did he describe them? He said they were too big, ceilings too high, platforms too wide, built for something other than trains, built for something that traveled in ways we don't anymore. Pavel's DNA test had come back the same way, ancestry data unavailable. I flew to Switzerland in March. The air was cold and clear and tasted like the end of winter. I had arranged to meet a man I'll call Victor. He'd spent 30 years at the Human Genome Diversity Project, one of the most comprehensive efforts to catalog human genetic variation on the planet. He was retired now, living in a small apartment near the lake. He agreed to meet me because he said he was old enough that he didn't care anymore what they did to him. The Diversity Project was supposed to document every human population on Earth, he said. We sat on a bench overlooking the water. Swans moved through the gray mirror of the lake. We collected samples from thousands of isolated villages, populations that had lived in the same place for 10,000 years. You must have found the anomalous samples. We found them in 1994. He was quiet for a moment. Our first major collection effort in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Western Siberia. We were documenting populations that had been studied very little. Soviet restrictions, you understand. Many of these groups had been closed off for decades. What did you find? We found that many of them, more than many, thousands of them, shared genetic markers that didn't match any known population. Not any. These markers were distinct, coherent, internally consistent. They represented a real genetic inheritance, a real people. What happened? Victor watched the swans for a long time before answering. We were preparing to publish. It would have been one of the most significant papers in the history of human genetics. A new population, a distinct lineage, something that had been completely undocumented. But you didn't publish. We were visited. by representatives of 4 governments. 4. They arrived at our facility on the same day, within hours of each other. Russian, American, British, Chinese. They knew what we had found. They knew before we'd told anyone. What did they say? They said the data had to be suppressed. They said it was a matter of historical stability. Those were the exact words. Historical stability. They said some truths were too dangerous to be known. And you agreed? Victor's hands, resting on his knees, began to tremble slightly. Not from cold. We were afraid. They made it clear that the consequences would be severe. Not for us, for our families, for our children, for everyone we loved. He turned to look at me. I have regretted it every day since, but I did what they asked. We buried the data. We erased the samples. We pretended we had never found them. But they're appearing again. 2 million people. More than 2 million. The descendants of the people we erased. They didn't disappear. They scattered. They married into other populations. They had children, and now their great-grandchildren are taking DNA tests, and the truth is leaking out through cracks we couldn't seal. I began to understand the shape of what had been hidden. It wasn't just genetic data. It was everything. An entire civilization had been systematically erased from human memory, and the tools of erasure were breathtaking in their scope. In Moscow, I found a historian who had worked in the Soviet archives during the Glasnost period. She told me about entire floors of documents that were marked historical deprecated, a category she had never seen before or since. These weren't classified, she said. They were unexisted. They had been removed from all catalogs, all indexes. You could only find them if you already knew where to look. What was in them? Maps, thousands of maps, all showing the same thing, a vast territory spanning from the Urals to the Pacific, labeled with a single word, Tartaria, or Tartaria in older documents, a civilization that our textbooks called a geographic confusion or a misunderstanding by European cartographers. But the documents showed it was real. The documents showed it was enormous, organized, advanced. The Russians didn't conquer an empty wilderness when they expanded east. They conquered something that was already there, something that had been there for centuries, maybe longer. In London, I spoke with a linguist who had studied the language patterns of the anomalous populations. They share linguistic features that don't fit into any known language family, she said. Not Indo-European, not Turkic, not Mongolic, something older, something that should be a parent language to others, but has no children in any known linguistic tree. How is that possible? It's only possible if someone deliberately killed the language, killed it and all its descendants, killed it so thoroughly that no trace remains, except in the people who still carry it in their blood. In Beijing, a contact put me in touch with a geneticist who had worked on a classified project in the 1990s. We spoke through 3 layers of encryption. He would not show his face. The Chinese government has known about this population since at least 1976, he said. When they conducted genetic studies of the Western provinces, they found the same anomalies, the same markers, the same impossibility. What did they conclude? They concluded that a significant portion of their population, millions of people, were descended from a civilization that official history says never existed, a civilization that was older, more advanced, and more widespread than anything the textbooks describe. And they suppressed it. Everyone suppressed it. Russia, China, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, all of them coordinated suppression across ideological lines, across the Cold War divide. Do you understand what that means? These nations that couldn't agree on anything, they agreed on this. They agreed that this truth must never be known. I found the name in 3 separate places: in Alexander's legacy code, in Victor's suppressed files, in a document that a former intelligence analyst shared with me, hands shaking, voice barely above a whisper. The Meridian Project. It was established in 1946, 1 year after the end of World War II. Its purpose, according to the documents, was the standardization of historical consensus across participating nations. Participating nations included every major power, every permanent member of the UN Security Council, and dozens of smaller countries, all bound by agreements that were never made public. The project had 2 goals, the intelligence analyst told me. We were sitting in a park in Washington, D.C. Cherry blossoms were falling around us like pink snow. The first was to ensure that the major powers agreed on what history was, not what it had been, what it would be, going forward. A unified narrative, a controlled past. And the second goal, to eliminate all evidence of competing narratives, all evidence of histories that didn't fit, all evidence of civilizations that complicated the official story of human development. Like Tartary. He looked at me with something like pity. Tartary was just the largest deletion. There were others. Smaller civilizations that had been absorbed or destroyed, technologies that had been suppressed, Knowledge that had been buried. The Meridian Project wasn't just erasing one people. It was curating all of human history, deciding what we would be allowed to remember. I traveled to Almaty in September. Kazakhstan in autumn is gold and bronze, the mountains edged with early snow. I was following the densest cluster of the DNA anomalies. More of the affected samples came from this region than from any other. Whatever had been erased, this was where the survivors had been thickest. I spent 3 weeks there, collecting stories. Every family I spoke to had something. A fragment, a memory, a piece of glass that wasn't glass, a photograph that showed buildings that shouldn't exist, a great-grandmother's recipe that used ingredients no one could identify anymore. But one story stayed with me more than the others. An old man named Dastan, 91 years old, living in a village an hour outside Almaty. His granddaughter had brought him to meet me. She had received the DNA error and had been searching for answers since. Dastan remembered. Not clearly he was a child when his family fled, but he remembered. The city they had Lafitte, the journey across mountains in winter, the strange men in gray uniforms who had come to their village and told everyone to leave. The city had a name that isn't allowed anymore, he said, speaking through his granddaughter's translation. I was taught to never say it. My father hit me once when I said it in public. Not hard, not to hurt me, to save me. Can you describe what you remember? He closed his eyes. His face, crossed with decades of weather and work, softened into something like wonder. There was a building in the center, very tall, made of something that looked like ice but wasn't cold. At night, it would glow. Not like fire like the moon. Soft and steady. My mother said it had been glowing since before anyone could remember, since before her grandmother's grandmother. What happened to it? When the men came, they made everyone leave. They told us the city was going to be cleaned. That word, cleaned. My father knew what it meant. He took us into the mountains. We hid for 3 days. On the second night, there was a light. Not like fire, like a second sun rising in the wrong place, and then a sound, not loud, deep, like the earth itself was crying. You saw the city destroyed. I didn't see it. I felt it. The ground shook, the air changed, and when we came out of hiding, the valley where the city had been was different. The shape of the land itself had changed. There was nothing Lafitte, not ruins, not rubble. Nothing. As if the city had never existed at all. Back in Europe, I found a researcher willing to analyze some of the anomalous samples. She worked at a private lab in Austria, outside the network of the major testing companies. She agreed to help because her own family had received the error. The genetic markers are real, she told me. 3 weeks after I'd provided her with samples from a dozen donors. This is a coherent population. They share distinctive markers on multiple chromosomes, inherited patterns that could only come from a common ancestry, a large distinct population that existed for hundreds of generations, at minimum. What can you tell me about them? Several things. First, they were reproductively isolated for a very long time, thousands of years at least. They didn't mix significantly with surrounding populations until relatively recently, probably the 19th or early 20th century, based on the patterns of admixture. What else? Second, they were healthy, unusually healthy. The markers associated with genetic diseases are largely absent. Whatever selection pressures they experienced, they produced a population with remarkable genetic robustness. And third, she hesitated, looked at her notes, looked at me. Third, they're old. The genetic diversity patterns suggest this population has been distinct for far longer than any other known human group. The Bushmen of southern Africa are usually considered the most genetically diverse population, the oldest branch of modern humans. These samples show comparable diversity, maybe more. What does that mean? It means either this population is as old as the oldest human populations on Earth, or older. It means their genetic history extends back further than we thought human genetic history could extend. I needed to understand why. Why go to such lengths? Why involve every major government? Why suppress not just a people but all memory of them? I found part of the answer in an archive in St. Petersburg, a section of the old imperial collection that had been overlooked during Soviet cataloging. Among the documents was a report from 1842, a survey conducted by the Russian Empire of their newly acquired territories in Central Asia. The surveyor's name was Petrovich. His report was 847 pages long. Most of it had been redacted. Entire sections blacked out, but fragments remained. The natives speak of a time before the Khans, one passage read. They speak of a golden age when their ancestors commanded powers we cannot comprehend. They describe machines that moved without horses, lights that burned without fire, voices that carried across vast distances without messengers. Another passage. I have examined the ruins they showed me. They are not consistent with any known civilization. The precision of the stonework exceeds what we can achieve with modern tools. The materials used include alloys I cannot identify. I cannot explain how these structures were built, or by whom, or when. And another, barely legible. They claim the old civilization was destroyed by invaders from the West. Not the Mongols, someone before the Mongols, someone who feared what the old ones knew. They say the knowledge was hidden, not lost. They say the descendants carry it still, waiting for the time when it is safe to remember. I almost didn't find it. Almost gave up before I did. It was in a basement in Ulaanbaatar, a private collection belonging to a family who had been archivists for generations. They had preserved things that shouldn't have survived, things that would have been destroyed if anyone had known they existed. Among their collection was a document, hand-copied from something older, written in a script that no one could read anymore, but with a translation, in Russian. On facing pages, the original document, according to the family, had been created in 1728. A copy of something far older, a history of the people who had lived in the heart of Asia before anyone else. I cannot reproduce it here. I was asked not to. But I can tell you what it described. A civilization that had lasted for thousands of years. A civilization that had developed technologies we are only now beginning to understand. A civilization that had been deliberately destroyed, not by conquest but by agreement. By a pact among neighboring powers who feared what the old ones knew. The document described the destruction in detail. The coordinated attacks, the burning of libraries, the murder of scholars, the systematic destruction of every structure, every record, every piece of evidence that the old ones had ever existed. But it also described what survived, the descendants who scattered, the knowledge that was hidden in stories and songs and genetic memory, the belief passed down through generations, that one day the truth would emerge. When the children of the old ones number in the millions, the document read, and when they begin to ask questions, and when the machines of the new age reveal what the persecutors tried to hide, then the time of remembering will begin. 2 million people have taken DNA tests and received the same error. 2 million descendants of something we've been told never existed. 2 million threads leading back to the same buried truth. I've spent 2 years following those threads. I've spoken to hundreds of people. I've read thousands of documents. I've traveled to places that still carry the memory of what was lost. And I still don't have complete answers. I don't know exactly who the Tartarians were. I don't know the full extent of their civilization. I don't know exactly what technologies they developed, or how, or why their neighbors feared them enough to erase every trace. But I know they were real. I know 2 million people carry their genetic signature. I know governments have spent almost a century making sure we never found out. And I know the truth is still there, encoded in DNA, that the algorithms can't classify, written in stories that grandmothers whispered to children, preserved in fragments of glass that no jeweler can identify. I went back to see Maria, in upstate New York, before I finished writing this. Spring was coming. The trees were beginning to bud. The hills were turning that early green. That feels like hope. She made tea, the same kind her grandmother used to make, though she didn't know where the recipe came from. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. I thought about it. The thousands of miles, the hundreds of testimonies, the fragments of truth assembled from the wreckage of erasure. "I found the shape of it," I said. "I found the hole where the truth used to be." She nodded, like she understood. "My grandfather used to say something," she said. He'd say it when I asked about the old country, about where we came from. He'd say some truths don't disappear. They just wait. She looked out the window at the hills, at the light slanting through new leaves. "Maybe 2 million error messages is how truth waits," she said. "Maybe it's how truth knocks on the door. Quiet at first, then louder, until someone finally opens it." I finished my tea. The cup was warm in my hands. Outside, birds were singing. Spring was coming, and somewhere, in a quarantine database, 2 million genetic profiles waited. 2 million threads leading back to a buried past. 2 million questions without answers. 2 million people who were told they didn't exist. But they do. They're everywhere. They're in every country, every city, every family that carries the old blood. And now they're starting to ask questions. Now they're starting to compare notes. Now they're starting to remember. The error message says, "Ancestry data unavailable." But the data is there. It's always been there, waiting, like truth always does.